these are pictures of the way in which we, I suppose, still talk about the economy, and certainly the way in which, to a considerable extent, economic policy makers and people generally thought about economics in the age of nation building. And I want to suggest to you some other ways in which we can look at the economy. The way in which this was preeminently changed was from starting from 1973, since we are at the Whitlam Institute with the tariff cut. We moved to a somewhat more abstract understanding of what economies were. And economies that don't just make things, they trade things, and they trade things not just externally but internally as well. Hence a hell of a lot of the economic reform that we prosecuted from 73 onwards, and particularly from 83 onwards, revolves around that theme that we have to try and optimise the terms on which firms trade with each other and which firms trade with, Australian firms trade with firms overseas. But there are a whole lot more things that an economy is. We can think of an economy as a giant machine for generating and distributing information. Every time we do this, we think of a whole, it's like putting another pair of lenses on, and we can look around and see ways in which it suggests policy things to us. An economy is a giant externalities machine, if you like. It produces, firms produce things that they didn't particularly intend to produce, and that has to be dealt with. The economy, as we are becoming aware, is increasingly complex, and that raises a whole bunch of issues. It's a machine for making decisions, and again, there are ways in which, when we look at if we look at those lenses on, it gives us ideas about how we can do better. The economy is also a giant machine for managing risk. I put that on a separate slide because it's such a great picture. You can regard this as a picture of risk taking. I also think of the white mouse there as Wayne Swan and the cheese as resource rent. But then that illustrates the idea of risk management as well. So that's another thing that I think we really haven't thought about enough in terms of the economy. And it seems to me when you do that, two things happen. One is that you find $100 bills on the pavement. I think they're $1 bills, and or to change the metaphor, you find low-hanging fruit. And the second is that you find a whole lot of really very difficult problems. And then I think what you have to do is you have to start building institutions to try and deal with them, because we've built a lot of institutions, to get where we are, and they do really remarkable things. And I'll talk a little bit about that more. So let's have a look at information. There is the great, firstly, Hayek came along and told us that information was absolutely essential. Information at the periphery and all through an economy is incredibly important, and that was his big argument against central planning, that the planners at the centre wouldn't have the information. And then afterwards, people like Arrow, Stiglitz, Akerlof came along and said, yes, well, that's true, but the problem is that markets, there are all sorts of ways in which markets don't handle information well either. There's Friedrich Hayek, and given that this is the Whitlam Institute, I've only been able to secure him for a short period of time. And the takeout from that is that if we want to handle information well, we are going to have to produce hybrid institutions with aspects of public and private, with public and private aspects. So so Andrew's talked about ways in which information can drive improvements in all sorts of incredibly important systems. It's also important to keep in mind that it can unleash perverse incentives, which is why various teachers are upset about merit pay. And as Andrew said, that's a good reason to try and get more information on it, and what better than randomised trials. Reporting hospital death rates can, of course, simply create incentives to turn away the worst risks. And in fact, where those perverse results emerge, the best motivated can become extremely demoralised. And it can be we rely on professional ethics in hospitals and in schools, and we really want to be confident when there are ways of introducing measurement systems that reinforce those ethics. And if they're good, essentially if they're good, they will. And if they have these perverse incentives, to the extent that they do, you're dicing with some nasty things, and you want to be careful. And some examples in the United Kingdom. The Bristol Eye Hospital had targets to reduce waiting lists, and so it stopped sending out reminders for eye checkups, and so increased the level of blindness in Bristol, which is quite an achievement for an eye hospital, you've got to admit. And another way of reducing waiting lists was to take the wheels off trolleys, because then you had someone in a bed. So those are obviously things that you want to watch out for. When I was hawking my father from one oncologist to another, I invented a method that I was completely sure I would find in the literature, but I'd never found it, and I'll illustrate what it is. The easiest way is to do this with real estate agents to start off with, then we'll get on to oncologists. When you ask a real estate agent into your house to sell it, the first thing they'd tell you is, you know, I really love this house, I've got a kind of a bond with this house. And I think Agent 3 tells you that he thinks he can sell it for $450,000. What you really want to know is, what did you tell the other people and what did you get for their houses? And once you know that, you can work out that the person who told you you can work out who's likely to be the best real estate agent for you. Now, it's actually quite easy, especially if you're in a hospital and in a kind of a contained system. It's actually quite easy to track these things and to build that system. And so if we look at, say, an obstetric ward, and we ask the obstetric ward to tell us what will be your expected error rate, your expected adverse event rate with this particular delivery, and you get those results, then you correct it for the prognoses of the past, which are constantly tracked, and then you work out where you should go. Now, to get the idea across, I presented that as a sort of individual consumer. I actually think the use of this would be much more powerful with large buyers of medical services. And it would generate a tremendous amount of information, and is also not just risk rating, which is how you avoid the problem of getting hospitals to turning the bad risks away. It's also forward risk rating. Each individual hospital gets an opportunity to risk rate individual patients. Getting on to the Bristol Eye Hospital issues. One of the problems, we actually do have an audit of government services, and we don't take it very seriously. It's supervised by the Productivity Commission, but every year I go through it and I look for signs that there is some scepticism about the numbers and that there is some careful auditing of those numbers, and I never find it. These are essentially consensus, or these are figures that state governments have produced, and some of them will all be subject to their own disciplines, but we don't take it very seriously. That's not necessarily a criticism of anyone, because everyone's in this system trying to kind of bootstrap it and protect it from worrying politicians who are worrying about media stories, and so I'm not blaming them either. But it's something that we need to do.